I'm Chef Jennifer Cubillos, and today we're going to be making a traditional opera torte. This is a classical French cake made with a joconde, which is almond sponge cake. Then we'll be layering it with some coating chocolate, coffee buttercream, a medium ganache, and we'll be soaking the cake in coffee simple syrup and then putting a chocolate glaze on top. I'm going to have recipes for all of these items that have already been made down below. So we'll start off with our cake. We made this in another video. It's only a half sheet because I want to do a pretty small cake, but you could do a full sheet would make you 2 8 by 8 inch if you were trying to do full size, but we're going to be doing a couple of different smaller sizes today. So I want all my layers to be even, so I'm going to measure my cake first. I have 16 inches and I want 3 layers of cake, so I'm just going to evenly divide that by 3. So it's going to be about 5 1/3 inches. And I need to make sure I measure from both sides so those don't end up crooked. Now I can line them up with my ruler as my straight edge, and then just cut straight down that straight edge to make sure I get really nice clean lines. And if they're not perfect, it's okay. We're going to end up trimming this after we glaze it. We just want them to be as close as possible. So this is obviously my nicest piece, so I want that to be my top piece. I'm going to take my 2 pieces that I'm not ready for yet and just sit them to the side. Make sure you're really gentle with those because they are a little bit fragile. All right, so for my bottom piece, I'm going to be putting some coating chocolate on this. Now, coating chocolate is a chocolate that's not couverture. What that means is some of the cocoa butter has been substituted for usually a vegetable fat. And the reason why I would use this over tempered chocolate is because this cake, if I'm not serving it today, is going to need to be held in the refrigerator. We don't want to put couverture chocolate into the refrigerator because the humidity and the moisture will damage it. Whereas my coating chocolate will hold up a little better. I have this melted. This is the cocoa berry coating chocolate. And I just want to put a really thin layer. This is going to make sure that cake doesn't stick on the bottom, and I have a nice crisp, crunchy, chocolatey layer that's going to add a little bit of texture to my cake. So this is probably about 3 ounces of coating chocolate, and I want to make sure I go all the way to the very edge with this. Now, this is actually going to be the bottom. I'm going to flip this layer over. So I need this to set completely before I'm ready to do that. If you're in a cool room, you can usually take a break and go do something else and come back. But if you're in a really warm room, you'll probably want to refrigerate this for about 5 minutes until it's set. So now you can see that my chocolate is set, so I can just gently pick this up and turn it over. Since my parchment paper is no longer being taken up with cake, I'm actually going to go ahead and turn this long ways, so I'm giving myself a little extra room. So any sponge cake is going to be a little bit dry and, like a sponge, is made to soak up liquid. So in order to flavor this and use our coffee profile, I've made some coffee simple syrup, which is just equal parts hot coffee and granulated sugar that is dissolved together. I don't want to overdo this. I just want to gently soak this. I don't want it to become soggy. I just want to get this flavor in there and get my cake nice and moist. You could easily do this with a pastry brush. I just find this to be a really simple way of getting it to go exactly where I want it to go. All right, so now that my cake is covered, I'm going to start with a thin layer of buttercream. So I have about 8 ounces of coffee buttercream. This is an Italian buttercream. I added a 1/4 teaspoon of salt and a 1/2 teaspoon of liquid coffee, a tablespoon of liquid coffee extract. I'm gonna take about 3/4 of this and make a layer here. This might be more than I need, but I can always take some off. I wanna make a layer that's just slightly thinner than the width of my cake. So I'm using a small spatula here because you can see how small and thin my cake is. If I had a larger spatula, it'd probably be harder for me to get this to go exactly where I want it to. So always pick the spatula size that matches with the job that you're doing. So I'm using the tip of my spatula to push the buttercream into the corners and move things around. And then when I'm smoothing, I'm using the whole blade of the spatula and holding it nice and level and steady. So this should be approximately 6 ounces of buttercream that I have on my layer here. And when I'm smoothing it out, I can take my excess and I can scrape it right back in. You want to be gentle here because that moisture underneath from the simple syrup, it's not going to want to stick to this buttercream. So you might see it slide around. If you see that, you can just smooth it right back out. Pushing this all the way to the corners. Smoothing gently. This isn't a step that everyone does, but I like to come back around. Just even with the sides. Push those edges up to make sure I've gotten all the way to the edge. And then I can just come in from the sides and level that off. All right. Now that I feel like that's pretty level, I'm going to add my next layer of cake. So I feel like the other side of this cake, the bottom side of this cake, absorbs liquid a lot more easily than the top side with the crust. So I like to flip these over so I can soak my liquid into the bottom. I'm just going to press firmly to make sure that's adhering and sticking. And I want to make sure that it's nice and even, that it's not hanging over on one side and short on the other. So now that I feel good about that, I'll go back with my simple syrup. I want to make sure that I get full coverage here. Probably notice that I'm wearing gloves. Now, before this is baked, any germs that I might have, which are obviously working with clean hands, will be baked out in the oven. But after it's out of the oven, this is a ready-to-eat food. So we want to make sure that we're wearing gloves anytime we're touching ready-to-eat foods. So I've just smeared that all the way to the edge, and we're ready to do our next layer. So now we're going to go to our medium ganache. This is just 1 part cream to 1 part chocolate. I used a Calabo chocolate, which is about 54% couverture chocolate. And I've let that come to room temperature. You can do this while it's liquid, but then you'll need to refrigerate it until it's set before adding the next layer. That way it doesn't squish out of your cake. And I'm going to be doing about 6 ounces of the ganache as well. I want to make sure that I mix that up really well to get it nice and smooth, so it's not too thick on my cake. And I want to make a layer that's pretty much even with the layer of buttercream that I put on. Just like the buttercream, this is a very fatty item, so it's not really going to want to stick to that moist simple syrup layer. You just have to be a little gentle with it and move it around. Using the same technique to spread this out. When I'm moving large amounts, pushing with the tip of my spatula. When I'm smoothing it out, I'm using the whole spatula, gliding down the whole cake. So if you find that you haven't put quite enough, You can always just add a little bit more right to the areas where you need it. We're not so much concerned with putting exactly the same amount everywhere. What we really are looking for is those nice even layers. Make sure you push all the way to the corners. Now once again, I'm going to come back around, pushing my edges up. To make sure it's not thicker on the sides or thinner in the corners. I'm missing a little bit in my corner here. And then I can pull that back in. Now that that's reasonably smooth, I can go to my final layer of cake. Same as before, I'm just going to gently flip this over, and then I can adjust it to make sure it's perfectly even on all 4 sides. So we should still have a pretty level cake at this point. If each layer isn't level, then your final cake won't be level and you'll have a slant in one direction or another. You want to pay real attention to detail and making sure that you have precision in every step, and it's going to make your final product so much cleaner. Spread that back around. All right, now we're going to do one more layer of buttercream, but this is really just to seal the cake and create a smooth surface for our ganache to be poured over. So this time we just want enough, this is almost like a crumb coat, we just want enough to seal that cake and make this smooth. We're not going to need the full 6 ounces that we needed before. But anytime we're smoothing icing, we're using that same technique. Don't be scared to put too much on because you can always take it back off. We want this layer to be thinner than 1/8 of an inch. And you can see that my cake's kind of moving around underneath here because everything is not set yet. Before pouring this with my ganache, I prefer to refrigerate this at least 5 to 10 minutes until all that fat in my ganache and in my buttercream is fully set, so that when I cut it, the filling doesn't squish out of it. Making sure I go all the way to each corner. And then once again, I can push up the sides. Really elevated pastry is always about precision at each step. All right, so that looks nice and even. Now I'm just going to take this and I'm going to chill it for 5 to 10 minutes. And while I'm doing that, I can go ahead and make my ganache for glazing. Now I'm ready to start making my ganache for the top. So I have equal parts 40% heavy cream and my 54% chocolate, which is a Calabo. I just want to bring this cream to a scald. My other additions are going to be about 1/2 ounce of butter and about 1/2 ounce of glucose. The reason why I add these is not only does the butter enhance the flavor of the ganache, but both these items make the ganache a little more elastic. which is really important when we're glazing something, because a firmer ganache, once it's refrigerated over time, can start to crack because it becomes very firm and then breaks whenever it gets hard. This will make it a little more stretchy and a little more shiny so that it doesn't break. I'm going to go ahead and put my butter and my glucose right on top of my chocolate. I like to measure my glucose into plastic like this. That way, because this is very sticky, I can just pour it straight on top just by cutting a little hole and then squeezing this out like toothpaste. You can see my cream has come to a scald. So now I can pour this all directly over my chocolate. I want to make sure I take the time to scrape my pot out and get all of that cream in there. So I'm going to push everything underneath that cream, and I just want to let it sit for a couple of minutes so it can start to melt that chocolate and combine everything together. The process I'm about to do is emulsification. Emulsification happens whenever we combine a liquid and a fat. Those two items do not necessarily want to go together, but with the right balance of liquid to fat and agitation from stirring, we can cause that to happen. The reason why I'm using a rubber spatula and not a whisk is because I really want to limit the amount of air bubbles. That way I get a nice glossy top on my cake and I don't have air bubbles popping up all over the place. Now that I've let this sit for a moment, I'm going to start to gently stir just in the center. At first, this is going to look pretty ugly, like some chunky chocolate milk. But as we begin that emulsification in the very center of the bowl, it'll start to turn smooth and shiny. And you'll feel the texture of this start to change and thicken. Just little tight circles right in the center. So now you can see it starting to come together. And as we see that, I'll start widening my circle. So I'm pulling more and more of that liquid in. And once we get most of that, you can see I still have cream hanging out along the edges. I want to scrape the sides of the bowl and make sure I get everything properly emulsified. If this starts to look gritty or chunky at all, that means you've broken your ganache. That can happen for two reasons. One, you had a drastic temperature change. So if you added really warm cream to really cold chocolate. Or two, your balance of fat to liquid was off, which might mean that you need to reduce the fat by adding a lower fat liquid such as water or milk. But this looks really glossy and beautiful. We want a really nice viscosity that's pourable to really glaze our cake nicely. And you shouldn't see a lot of air bubbles in this. You also shouldn't see any chunks of chocolate, so make sure you're scraping the bottom of the bowl and that everything is nicely combined. So at this point, if your cake is nice and set, which you can check by touching the top and seeing that the buttercream is completely firm and doesn't stick to your finger, then we can get ready to pour. Cake is set, you can tell because I can touch this and no buttercream comes off on my finger. I'm ready to pour my glaze over the top. I don't need to worry about coating the sides, but I do need to make sure that it gets all the way to the corners. I want this to be a really nice, even layer of glaze. So I'm going to spread it out as quickly as possible because it'll start to solidify because of my cold cake. And I'm going to use my spatula to do one even swoop to make sure that it's completely level. So I'm gonna pour it straight from my bowl. And I wanna make sure I get into these corners, and it's okay if I have a little more than I need on here. Then I'm gonna make sure to take the tip of my spatula, make sure it goes all the way around really quickly. Then I'm gonna do one even push. I'm not really worried about all of this mess because I can pull that off later. I just want to make sure that my cake is nice and shiny and beautiful on top. I'm going to end up trimming these sides anyways. So I placed my cake into the refrigerator for about 5 to 10 minutes, just until the chocolate has had time to set. And now I've used my parchment paper to move it onto a cutting board for final cutting. I'm going to start off by trimming just 2 edges, and I want to make sure that the corner is going to be very square, that I'm not angled in too much or out too much. And I want to do that with a nice clean knife, making sure I hold my knife straight up and down and not cutting to either side. So I want this to be really nice and flat, and then I'll just push straight down. Once I get there, I can pull out from the side and remove that extra scrap. Now, when you're cutting, you want to make sure that your knife is clean for each cut. So in between cuts, I'm going to be wiping my knife on a clean, damp towel. Now, obviously, this knife is not going to be long enough to cut here. So I'm going to use a longer serrated knife so I can get it all in one cut. Same thing, I want to hold my knife straight up and down. And make sure that I have a 90-degree angle with my other, and I'm just going to mark this first to be certain that that looks nice and straight before cutting. So pushing straight down and pulling across. And I'm just going to pull this away from the cake, and you should see that we have nice even layers in the interior. I'm just going to scoop that up and pull it away. So now that we've done that, we have 2 nice clean sides to measure from. So I'm going to be cutting 2 sizes of pieces, one that would be suited for plating and one that's going to be a petit-four size. So for my plated size, I want this to be 4.5 inches deep. I want to make sure that I'm starting my measurement in my clean corner and measuring away from it. Same here, starting my measurement in this clean quarter. And I want these to be 1.5 inches wide. So 1/2 inch, 1 inch. I can mark here, 1.5 inches, and then 1.5 inches. Now that I've marked those sides, I want to flip it and mark the other side, but I need to be very careful that I don't start measuring on my uncut side. I measure from my nice clean cut side so that it lines up with my other measurements. So 1.5 inches, 1.5 inches, and 1.5 inches. So now, before I cut, I always want to make a mark. This way, if I've messed up, I haven't already cut the entire cake. So that looks pretty nice. So now that I'm going to go all the way to this side, and just like I measured 4.5 inches here, I want to go from my clean cut corner and measure 4.5 inches. So now I'm going to make a cut right here. If I were cutting them all into bars for plating, I would continue this all the way down. So now I want to make sure that my knife is nice and level, and I'm just evenly marking from one mark to the other. Now you can see each time I cut, my knife is looking clean. Pushing straight down, sliding to the other side, We are gonna end up with a little bit of scrap here. We like to call those chef snacks. But if I lay this down, you can see my really nice, even layers. And I'm just gonna move this out of the way. So before cutting my bars, once again, I wanna start with a nice, clean knife. And I'm just gonna line right up, straight up and down on that mark, and then push all the way down and slide through. You wanna slide your knife out because it keeps the top mark really nice and clean. It also makes sure that you're cutting all the way through your cake. So now I should easily be able to move this piece around and away. I'll continue cutting my other pieces. Cleaning my knife in between each slice. I'm just applying gentle pressure to the side of the cake to keep it from sliding around on my cutting board. So now I have 3 beautiful pieces. We're gonna decorate those in a moment, but for now I wanna get them to a nice safe space so that while I'm cutting the remainder of my cake, I don't damage these. So I can just pick them up and move them along. You can also do this with an offset spatula. I just happen to have this knife in my hand. So make sure, especially if you're cutting on parchment like that the parchment is whole underneath. If you see that there's squares missing from this parchment, it means that it's stuck to the bottom of your cake. And you definitely don't want to serve anyone parchment. So now we're gonna cut my pedophore sized pieces. I want to cut these into 1.5 by 1.5 inch squares. So I'm going to start by marking my sides from a clean edge. One and a half, 1.5, 1.5. Then make sure you're marking from the same side that you started on. If you start from the other side and it's not an exact measurement, then you might end up with crooked lines. 1.5, 1.5. Now I can go ahead and mark those, just lining them up from one side to the other. Now I can do this side. Slide it into the center, and I don't want to start from my uncut edge, I want to start from my clean cut edge. Marking each piece. And you'll start to memorize the measurements of 1.5 and 2 inches, so you can easily, quickly do that without doing the math in your head. Now I can mark those across as well, making sure that these look nice and perfect and square before I cut all the way through. If you're in a really warm room, you might need to be going back in between the refrigerator to make sure that this is really set when you're cutting it. If you're in a nice cool room like me, then you can probably just continue to proceed with cutting. So I want to go ahead and eliminate the scrap edge at the end, pushing straight down and pulling through. And I can just take this piece away. Make sure, clean knife for each cut. Straight down and pull through. So these are more of what you would do for pedophores that you might do for a tea or coffee, or mini desserts if you're in catering and maybe you're doing a party that wants a variety of different style of desserts. You could also do this if you're doing a plated dessert trio where you want several small desserts on one plate. Now that we have these cut, We're going to move them to a nice clean plate for decoration. For this purpose, I'm not going to plate all of these. I'm just going to do like you would do a small amenity, maybe for room service. You might send up a few pieces of something. So I can pull my piece away. I want to make sure that I'm being very delicate, that I'm not smearing these pieces around. Gently placing them and lining them up really evenly. So you can see that my spacing is a little off, but I'm going to adjust these gently and add a 5th piece. All right, so now I'm going to add some decoration. I have a little bit more of my coffee buttercream because it's going to add a nice contrast. And I've just put a small star tip. I'm going to do a rosette, so a nice tight concentric circle. I'm going to start here in the center, but I want this to be in the top left corner of my plate. So I'll start in the interior, make a small circle, and as I get back around, I'll ease off the pressure and pull to the side. Ease off the pressure and pull. Trying to make sure that these are all in the exact same spot, in the exact same height on each one. So we have a really nice polished look. So I have nice little rosettes there. Now I'm going to finish these. I'm going to put a nice chocolate covered espresso bean on my odd numbered ones, just resting on that rosette so that they're nicely in the center of the cake. And then for some differentiation, I have some Calibo white chocolate crisp pearls that I'm going to add just a couple of to my even number cakes. I can go ahead and go back to my larger pieces that I would use for regular plating and plate those. Place this nicely in the center of the plate. I have a bag with my ganache, and I'm just going to write opera on top of here to start with. Now, it might be a little difficult to see that dark on dark. Here's a little better view. But I'm going to accent that by adding some gold-coated candied cocoa nibs. And I'm just going to add those in a straight line right along the bottom of my cake. This just adds a little bit of contrast to my dark on dark piping. Instead of writing opera, I could also do any of the kind of border decor that you've seen in my piping video. You can see my final product. I have a couple of different examples of plating with different ganache piping, and then I have my little pedophore examples. I could have also done this piping in white chocolate, depending on what look I'm going for. Obviously, if this was going to be a plated element, I would probably have more items on here, such as a sauce or a frozen item. But for this example, it just looks nice and clean. My layers are nice and clean, and everything is cut nicely and square to really elevate how this looks. So these are our final opera torts.